Hello and welcome to another episode of Northside Now. This is the podcast where we take you on a tour through all of the ministries and the latest happenings around Northside Church to keep you better connected with your church family. My name is Patrick, and with me as always is my fabulous co-host, Kevin Bryan.
Hey everybody, there's no Glenn.
No, we don't know why he's here. He just decided to ditch us today, I guess.
Well, yeah, just like you guys talk about me when I'm out, he
Basically
just decided to flake out, apparently.
Like, where's his commitment, you know?
That work ethic.
Exactly.
Come on, Glenn. I'm
Slacking.
sure he's doing something very important.
He is, yes. We'll give him a break this time.
What are we going to talk about?
I don't know. We don't have a guest this week. It's just you and me. Actually, you know what I do want to talk about?
What's that?
So I was listening to this podcast, right?
Okay.
This is a big topic, just so everybody just buckle up. But I was listening to this podcast, and he was telling a story about this guy named Tony, who is a student at the Ohio University. And Tony worked for a major paint retailer, you know?
I know a few of those.
Yes, and he's a Gen Zer.
Okay.
And he was making TikTok videos, you know, when he's mixing paint, and he was like mixing some really cool colors and like, you know, throwing blueberries in the white, you know, just doing some cool stuff. Well, almost overnight, he realized he's got over 1 million followers, right? Which is, you know.
Sounds like what we have.
Yeah, 1 million followers, you know. Maybe I just need to start mixing some paint on video, but I'll just link our audio with some paint videos and we'll be good to go. No, but he sees this as a marketing opportunity for the business. Mm-hmm. So he puts together a proposal and takes it to some of the higher ups to say, hey, we can use this, we can leverage this for marketing.
Yeah.
And instead of doing that, their reaction was, you're probably stealing the paint. You're doing this on company time when you shouldn't be. And they fired him instead.
Wow.
So you know what he did?
What?
He took his 1.4 million followers and started his own paint company. And now he's doing fine.
That's smart.
But the first company, because they didn't understand and couldn't see from, this is going to offend some people, the boomers out there.
Right.
They couldn't see from the Gen Z perspective that TikTok could potentially give them a boost to their revenue. It's like they couldn't see the world through this guy's eyes, and so they lost out on all this potential marketing. So, I don't know. When I was listening to this, I thought it would be very pertinent for us to talk about generations and the differences in generations, because right now we have, 5 generations still working together in the workforce, which is unprecedented.
Right. And
each generation is very different and sort of shaped by the culture that they grew up in. So tell us a little bit about, I think you've got the chart over there.
Well, it's funny. I love the way you introduced that, because we've been talking about this for probably an hour before we actually.
No, this is totally off the cuff. You know?
I mean, I didn't mean to say that. I've been thinking about this for 2 years, actually. I listened to the same podcast that you were referring to, and it was interesting because I do see a lot of examples now, especially if you look on social media, which is part of most all of our lives now, regardless of how old you are. If you use a hashtag, there's these hashtag battles going on, right?
Oh, yeah, they've been going on for years.
During the pandemic, for sure, the example that I heard recently was you had some boomers that were attacking the Gen Xers. I think it was hashtag how to confuse a millennial.
Yeah.
Sorry, Gen Y, millennials. Things like, how do you hang up the phone?
Yeah. How do you use a phone book or
those
a phone
kinds of
booth?
Things. Yeah. The millennials shot back with "Okay Boomer." Okay Boomer. And then you've got Gen Z taking on the Gen Xers with "Okay Karen."
Yes. You got to talk to the manager. Yeah.
For those, older folks that are complaining about everything or, whatever. Actually, one that I didn't see too much, but you may have seen it, was hashtag Boomer Remover.
Oh yeah, that one hurt.
Which
that one's kind of harsh.
Gen Z saying that's what COVID was.
Yeah, COVID was the Boomer Remover. Yeah, that one's a little harsh. I think
that one's tough.
Yeah,
that one's tough. But my point is that we have all these generations that quite often just stereotype each other
without trying to get to learn about each other and why we're different and why we are the way we are, because you can definitely look at the culture and the reasons why people react this way. That's and right. You can see the trend.
And the more you, like in the words of my math teacher in high school, the more you know, the more you know.
Yeah.
I think the more we know about these groups and just general trends that we get to see. Now, I would not say that these apply to every person in that bucket. That's not what we're saying. But I do think there's some generalities that we can talk about from the people who have done the research.
Oh, for sure.
To help us understand each other. And the more we understand each other, the more we can communicate effectively and work together.
Yeah. And I mean, we work at a church and our mission is to draw all people in.
Right.
If we have 5 different generations in the workforce, that is also true for the church. You know, we have 5 different generations here. How do we draw all of them in? Like, how do we be a body of Christ, one body of Christ together? You know, there's the scripture that talks about how, you know, you might be an eye, I might be an ear, you know,
right.
But we're all parts of one body. We need to recognize the differences, embrace those differences, and learn how to use them to the advantage of the glory of God.
Well, and if you're a part of a ministry and you're looking for volunteers, which you and I have talked about this recently on the tech team, we need folks that are interested in working so that we can give some people a break and just so that we can teach others how to do the things that we do here at Northside. So if you're interested in getting people, how do you speak to them?
Yeah.
In a way that makes sense. How's it relevant? I think on the last podcast we talked about Kelly McAllister was on. And her being a communicator and how she responds to questions is a challenge because they're always asking the same questions. She can respond differently in different ways and say different things.
Yeah.
The same's true here. But I think it's important for us to discuss it because for me, just specifically, it helps me understand where my kids are coming from.
Yeah.
If I'm a person in the baby boomer generation, it'll help you understand where your grandkids are coming from. And probably why your parents act the way they do or acted the way they did.
Yes.
So let's go through them real quick. I'm not going to go through everything. Most of this information comes from a guy, Dr. Tim Elmore, and you can find this information online. And he is the one that was interviewed in this particular podcast with Carey Nieuwhof, if you're familiar with him. He's a leadership expert and a pastor.
Yeah, and Tim Elmore's written like 40-something books.
That's crazy. He's had TED Talks. This is kind of his thing.
Yeah. And this book that he was referencing in this is called what? Changing Diversity?
The New Kind of Diversity.
The New Kind of Diversity. Yeah. That's what it was.
So it talks specifically a lot about Gen Z, etc. But there are generally some reasons why we see commonalities in these generations. So when he explains it, there's actually 7 generations we talked about that possibly could be.
I think there's, what did he say, seven generations that are alive, correct, but only 5 that are in the workforce.
Right. So if you go through all 7, the oldest generation would be, I'm not sure if it's always called the senior generation.
It's the one that was originally referred to as the quote unquote greatest generation.
Correct. Yeah. Correct. What Tom Brokaw talked about. These would be people that are in their 90s now.
World War II vets.
Correct.
You know, that age.
But then the one that is more common in our work environment today are the builder, the silent generation, sometimes called traditionalists. So they're born between 1925 and 46. So you have that in the World War II era.
Yeah. They were a little young to participate in the war, but they kind of came up in the Great Depression.
Correct.
Yeah.
And so as you can imagine, that builds a certain amount of different characteristics in someone.
And they tended to have fewer kids because they were growing up in the Great Depression. They were always a lot more frugal with their means, their resources.
And my grandparents are in this bucket. And so you think about, there was a explosion of gardening in that time period because of the lack of food being available in the Depression. But you really have a strong set of values around never giving up. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps kind of thing, determined to get the job done, whatever it takes. They didn't really have a whole lot of access or experience with technology, though. I mean, we had the telephone, right? But there really wasn't computers yet. If you even think about television, that's black and white.
Yeah, and most people couldn't afford one.
At the end, right.
And even then, when TV wasn't really in people's homes, until what, the late 50s, early 60s, really. And so it's like these people would be 20, 30 plus years old, and so it's like for the majority of their life, they didn't have that screen time.
Yeah, if these folks are active in a work environment, they might generally be the owner that still has an office, that wants to hang around because they need something to do, but they're not as common. It's about 2% of the workforce, according to Dr. Elmore. So they'd definitely be in about their 80s, that kind of time frame. Mm-hmm. So then after that, about 9 months after World War II was over.
So that greatest generation comes home.
You have an explosion in the maternity ward.
Yeah.
And we've all heard this name, the baby boomers.
Uh-huh. Well, that was also kind of exacerbated because it was around that time that the interstates were implemented, right?
So Eisenhower and the...
Uh-huh. And so when troops returned from war, they had a lot more access to settle anywhere they want, and they just sort of spread out and had kids. And
yeah, there was a response. If you think about, well, we didn't talk about it, but in the silent generation or the builder generation, the way they approached authority was that you respect them.
Yes. And it was be grateful you have a job.
That's exactly right.
Don't complain about your job. Just be grateful you have it.
And for me, I definitely heard that from my grandparents. Mm-hmm. And so I recognize that. And I did recognize the value of that. That wasn't as relevant to me in my growing up, but I definitely heard that from them. The baby boomers, however, saw what they maybe saw in their parents' generation and felt like, I deserve better than that.
Well, yeah, that's what I thought was interesting was he said they were the first generation that expected better than their parents or felt entitled to better than their parents because their parents came up in the Great Depression,
right?
In very lean times, but they don't live in a depression right now. This is after World War II. They're growing up in the greatest economic boom in the world, like in the history of the world. This is like the golden era. In the United States, at least, because the rest of the world kind of got bombed to where they couldn't quite compete after World War II. And we were, there's a lot of factors there, but the United States really flourished after World War II. The boomers were the largest generation by birth rate, so they kind of took over quickly.
They were optimistic, like you said. They were ambitious. Let's just replace them. Their view of authority was, let's replace them.
Well, and it's interesting now because a lot of that generation, the boomer generation, is still in the workforce and is still a significant portion of the workforce because there has not been a generation yet to... Well, the millennials now might have the numbers on them. Birth rate wasn't quite as high, but I think now the millennials might have the numbers on them in the workforce. The boomers are still a significant portion. They were like one of the largest generations in history, if not the largest generation. Even between the Gen Xers, the millennials, the Gen Zers, all coming up under the boomers, there are not enough numbers there to replace everything. So it's interesting, but the boomers that kind of took over quickly from their parents and previous generations are still the ones kind of leading the way on in the workforce.
Well, and it's interesting too because they were ambitious and sought to replace the previous generation, and they are still in a lot of places in the workforce. And this is nothing against the boomers for sure. We're not trying to denigrate any one of these particular groups or raise them above any one of the others. We're just trying to understand the differences.
Yeah. Just trying to look at the statistics and the facts. And
statistically, in a lot of cases, some boomers have to work.
Yeah.
Because their retirement that they set aside in the dot-com crash was decimated. And so in order to continue to have a certain way of life or even to survive in some cases, they still have to work. And so
in addition to Tim Elmore, the podcast and the book, there's another book that I've been reading, which I'm only maybe a quarter of the way into it, but it's kind of scaring me a little bit at this point. It's by this guy named Peter Zeihan.
Oh, old Pete.
Yeah, old Pete. You love Pete. I've been talking about him too much. But he studies demography, like demographics, but he also talks about geopolitics and all this kind of stuff and how globally all of this affects. But because he studies demographics, he talks about the generations a lot. And we used to, generationally, it looked like a pyramid. We had a lot of babies being born, so that was your base of the pyramid. Your 20s, your 30s, that's when you're consuming most of the stuff and you have a good portion of 20s and 30s. Your 40s and 50s, they're the ones that are investing.
Yeah.
And then you have a smaller portion of your 60 plus, your retirees. After World War II, like we talked about, there was the baby boom. And as urbanization happened and industrialization and people moved from the farm to the cities, people had less kids because you're going to have less kids in an apartment than you are out on a farm. The resources are different there. So our pyramid became more of a column. And so it was almost equal in how many babies to 20s and 30s to 40s and 50s to 60s plus. Those ages were a little more even. Well, as we've moved into today's world, that has become an inverted pyramid where generations are having fewer and fewer kids. So we have this huge amount of 60 plus that are about to hit mass retirement, and we don't know what that's going to look like financially for our country. Then we don't have enough 40s and 50s to invest enough to support that many retirees. And you don't have enough 20s and 30s to be buying everything. And you don't have enough kids to replace a workforce. So it's
changed.
It's changed dramatically because the boomers were the largest generation. And granted, the millennials are the next biggest because they're the kids of the baby boomers. So a large generation will beget a large generation. But the Gen Xers, they're a very small generation. The reason the baby boom stopped and the Gen Xers started, and that's where they mark that generational divide, is that was the introduction of birth control and the Roe v. Wade and things like that, which really reduced the birth rate. Gen X was a very small generation. Well, because of that, their kids, the Gen Zers, which we're seeing now graduating college and stuff, they're also a very small generation. If they're smaller, and so it's just interesting to look at that trend.
Well, it's a good point you bring up because I was going to say the marking of the end of the baby boom generation is the birth control pill and some other things. But you also had Vietnam and inflation, which also caused a decline in the growth. You had civil rights, those kinds of things. So then let's get into Generation X, Gen X.
Oh, you're the expert there.
This is where I fall. So it's born between 1965 and 1979. And I was born in 73, so I'm toward the end of that group. But their parents often looked at them as slackers. That was a nickname that they were given. But actually, they're very entrepreneurial.
I think every parent gives their kids the slacker.
Something negative. But they were known as the inventors of the work-life balance, if you've heard of this.
Yes.
So it's not just trust all of your people in authority. There is something important about your work, but also what you do outside of work too. So that creativity, maintaining that work-life balance are part of the values there. If you've ever heard work smarter, not harder.
Yeah. It was about learning how to work so that you can have a life.
That's right.
Yeah, it's a work to live, not live to work,
Exactly. And that's, again, this is not a value judgment, but that's definitely a 180-degree switch from when you were just thankful to have a job.
Yeah, because the boomers, their parents, the silent generation, told them, just be grateful you have a job. Don't complain,
Yeah. With Gen X, you definitely have a proficiency in technology. So some of the early things we talked about, the phone, TV, the computer, are definitely in part of their growing up. And I can testify to that. That's definitely something. Email communication came in toward the end of that, and it was really more in the 80s, but that started to become a thing. But their sort of life paradigm when they were getting ready to enter the career force is keep it real. They had gone through the Vietnam we had talked about. Watergate had happened. And so their view of authority was a little bit of mistrust, some cynicism there, and being jaded.
I can relate.
But as a result, there was a lot of, as I said, creativity, entrepreneurial spirit.
Well, yeah, and a lot of that I think also came from, a lot of times Gen Xers are referred to as latchkey kids.
Yes.
Because with the boomer generation, it was also one of the first times that women were in the workforce as well, which kind of helped increase their numbers in the workforce comparatively. But because both mom and dad were working, Gen Xers would come home from school and just be by themselves. And they had to teach themselves a lot and figure a lot of stuff out for themselves. I wasn't alive then. I don't know. I'm not a Gen Xer.
Well, and it's interesting that you say that because as a result of the latchkey kids, there was a total shift in how children were viewed.
Oh, yeah. Well, there was a kid that got abducted, right? And his parents really started a movement.
Yep.
And that's when you started seeing like kids' faces on milk cartons.
That's right.
And all of the, stranger danger stuff. And it totally shifted the way parents thought about their kids. And it was like, oh my gosh, we've got to take care of our kids. And that's what you saw. Baby on board stickers.
The diaper changing stations in the bathrooms.
Those didn't exist until then. And it sort of had this shift of kids are everything. We've got to protect the kids, which, introduced the millennial generation, which was a large generation because people started having kids again.
Right. Well, let's just move into that. So the millennials, Gen Y is also what they're called.
Yeah.
Kind of from 1980 to 97. So the 80s and 90s pretty much.
Yep. That's me.
Yeah. So you fall into this as they were entering their career time frame. This is fascinating to me. What Dr. Tim says here is their motto would be life is a cafeteria.
Oh, yeah.
And so that bears some unpacking a little bit. In terms of technology, there were plenty of things here. And it was a little bit later for you, but you had the smartphone coming into play. Well, a cell phone.
Yeah. So
for sure.
I'm kind of right in the middle, and I can relate because I was born in 88. Millennial goes to what, 96? It's like 80.
96, 97.
Yeah, somewhere in there. So I'm kind of like right in the middle of the millennials. And because of this, I can kind of relate some to the Gen Xers. I still had the childhood that everybody talks about. I was out on my bicycle riding around the neighborhood. And,
right.
all this kind of stuff. I didn't have a cell phone until I was 16. And that was only because I started driving and my parents wanted me to get a cell phone. And you know what that cell phone did? It called people.
Yeah.
They wouldn't even let me text because it was like, 10 cents, whatever, I don't even remember, but
texting was extra.
And they didn't want to pay extra. So literally my phone could call people. I didn't have a smartphone until I was in college. It was the early iPhone. So it couldn't do half the stuff that it can do these days.
Right.
But I have enough of that early childhood without the invasion of social media and the internet just being everything, all consuming. So I can relate some to the Gen Xers. I think I also inherited some of the cynicism and the conspiracy theories because I'm very much more I think I'm more conspiracy theory minded than you are.
That's definitely true.
But I'm also young enough that I can kind of relate to the Gen Zers that come after me because I did grow up with a lot of technology, even though it wasn't internet,
Right. So the work ethic for Gen Y is, you're willing to work hard as long as it meets your needs.
Yeah. Well, I was told growing up that I could be anything I wanted to be.
And, that's true because one of the things that was mentioned in this podcast was this is the generation, because it was such a shift from latchkey kids and that kind of environment. Now you have trophies just for participation. And the mantra, the kind of the three things that people were really concerned about for the kids in this generation was safety, status, and self-esteem. And so a real big focus is we're now starting to think about the mental well-being of our kids. So definitely don't want to disappoint them, don't want to exclude. So trophies, ribbons for participation.
I've got a shoebox full of them.
Encourage them, that kind of thing. And then with the advent of the technology, it becomes a little bit more fluid, may not be the right word, but you can almost do whatever you want to do. And so you do have, and by the way, you had said this before, this is the biggest generation in the workforce right now.
Right now, currently, yeah.
One stat I saw was like 80 million of them in the U.S.
Yeah.
Right now, in terms of in the millennial generation, which would be about 34% of the workforce, which is about equal to Gen X.
Yeah.
So there's tons of millennials. And you see this in culture, and you hear this all the time too. And the influence of the millennial is definitely pretty strong in our culture right now. So
I still think a lot of people, when they think millennial, they think these young kids. But
right.
We've got millennials that are 40 now, so it's,
Well, and you think about it, one of my areas of interest is the space program. And you see a lot of companies with CEOs that are kind of in this millennial bucket. And innovators and willing to go for it now as opposed to wait 10 years. I just saw a video just the other day about 3D printed houses.
Oh, yeah.
It's a form of concrete, and there's this community, I think it's in Texas somewhere. I should have looked that up and brought that in. But these houses are like 2,000 square foot houses.
Yeah.
And have about all the amenities you would have with a wood framed house, but it's stronger. It's faster to put up.
It's cheaper because it's
cheaper.
You don't have to have the manpower,
And it looks great.
Yeah.
So just that
innovation.
Who would have thought 10 years ago we'd have a 3D printed house? Or there are companies there's one that has about 80% of their rocket is 3D printed. Their rocket.
Yeah. Are you going to trust a 3D printed rocket to take you to space? Well,
apparently, if it doesn't blow up, why not?
Yeah, honestly, it's probably more accurate that way because a computer built it than.
So, lots of different changes. Yeah. Then let's go to the sort of hot generation right now. Oh, yeah. Gen Z.
Well, I want to preface Gen Z because in that podcast episode, they talked about it was kind of a good analogy. And as somebody that spends a large portion of their life in front of a screen, it was kind of an interesting way to look at it. So back in the 60s, when screens were first being introduced to houses, and I mean, even before that with larger movie screens, watching anything on a screen was like a group activity.
Yeah. You sat down and you watched a program.
You went to the movie theater with a group of people. Even if it was in your house, you had one box in your living room and everybody gathered around and you watched your program. You watched I Love Lucy or whatever it was. And I think at the time they said if you were like the number one show at the time, that was about 40% of the American population was tuning in to watch your program.
Yeah. That example they gave was Gunsmoke.
Gunsmoke, that's what it was, yes.
Captive audience.
But that also meant that 40% of the population could then talk to each other about that thing.
Yeah, conversation that you could, yeah.
Uh-huh. And as screens have become less public and more private, everything has sort of fractured in that way. And you see it, I think they talked to that Will and Grace in the 90s.
Yep.
Was the last time a show had a significant portion of the population watching it. And I think it was at, 14%?
14, yep.
They said even now, Netflix, if it has a big show, it's maybe 1% of the population is watching it. I've talked about this before, about how my generation is kind of the first generation, or the last generation, I guess, to know a lot of pop culture references from previous generations. And part of that is because there just wasn't as much content. And then early on in my life, when the whole 24-hour news thing was still new, and not just 24-hour news, but just 24-hour programming cycles, and you have all these different channels, and they needed content to fill the time slots.
Yep.
They would pull from old stuff. That's why I've watched Brady Bunch and Andy Griffith Show and all Looney Tunes cartoons and all this content from previous generations, which gave me sort of a touchstone. I can have a conversation with somebody, about Bewitched. Bewitched came out in the 60s. I didn't watch Bewitched when it came out, but I can talk about that.
Yep, same here.
But now Gen Z, they don't have time. The amount of content that is coming out and they're being bombarded with is insane. You couldn't watch everything that came out today. No one person could watch all of the content in their lifetimes.
Yep, exactly.
I don't have stats. I wonder if there is that stat available. Like, how many lifetimes would it take for you to watch everything that's out there?
It'd be crazy.
But as screens have become smaller and more private and more niche, and the internet and everything else, the communities are smaller and smaller and smaller, and life just feels so much more fractured. You don't have that same 40% of the population can all talk about one Gunsmoke episode. You just don't have that anymore. That's a good way to kind of visualize where Gen Z is at, because their life, as they've known it, has been that much more fractured and just sort of all over the place. There's so many more options available to them, even in what TV show am I going to watch,
Yeah.
And those options go well beyond TV,
And I think that's really a good point to talk about when it comes to all of us, because many of us, especially in the, millennial bucket, but even us Gen Xers, we're familiar with technology. And so we've integrated somewhat with technology. It's definitely different than Gen Z. But when you do go from this common single screen to very private individual screens, you develop these niches.
Yeah. He talked about how even like within a family, even if the whole country's not watching the same program, a lot of times a family would get together and watch an episode of something after dinner, whatever, and be able to talk about it. Well, now everybody just gets on their phone and everybody's digesting different content, which means they're all being shaped differently and they're all kind of joining their own little niche communities, individual from them, each other, even within one family.
Well, one example he said I thought was funny. I, as a parent, I know what my kids' Instagram accounts are, but they might have 5 Finstas.
Oh yeah, Finstas.
The fake Instagram accounts that they do various things with, and so there's that other level of separateness that we don't even get to see sometimes.
Yeah.
Gen Z is generally late 90s, so 97, 98 to 2015, 16, somewhere in there. And what you mentioned is a strong influence in the way Generation Z thinks and the values they hold. So as Dr. Elmore says here, the values are really about flexibility and technology. If I can't find it, I'll find it somewhere else.
Yeah.
They are a master of that technology because that's all they've really ever known.
And they don't even like ask parents the same questions anymore. They just Google it. You know, thanks to Google, Siri and Alexa and I don't know, whoever else is out there AI wise, Chat GPT now.
So if you're a parent that has a child in this generation, or you're a grandparent that has a grandchild in this generation, see if any of this stuff lines up with some of the things you kind of see.
Yeah.
It resonated with me. Sometimes they seem like they know it all. Okay. I've had that experience with some of my kids. And the truth is, they may know more than me because of the access
They've had
have to
Google
the internet
in their hand.
So thanks to Google, Alexa, and Siri,
Yeah.
they can have any information at their fingertips. And so it may seem like they're very confident initially in a work environment. But if you dig past that initial layer, they may be extremely insecure and not confident.
Yeah.
And
I think
why?
that's one of the trends is Gen Zers, they appear confident, but that confidence crumbles very quickly when put under pressure.
And the way they said it was there's high agency, but also high anxiety.
Yes.
Think about it. The anxiety comes with there are so many more options today, information available because of the technology.
Yeah.
That it's overwhelming.
Well, I'm glad you said overwhelming because I want to talk about this. So in this episode, Tim Elmore talks about how there's an acronym that he uses to talk about Gen Z, that demographic. This is helpful for everyone. I think it's been helpful for me just kind of understand because even though I'm a millennial and my generation kind of butts up against theirs, there's still some differences there for sure. And so this has kind of helped. But the acronym is FOREIGN. Okay. Because let's be honest, they're foreign to all of us.
That's what it seems like sometimes. Yes.
So remember that when you see that, that kid is foreign. You just remember this. So the F stands for fluid. Because that is something that is big in this generation that hasn't really been a thing in past generations. And not just in gender identity or any of that kind of stuff, because it is. The stat that he used, I think, was that 48% of Gen Zers aren't sure where they fall on the gender spectrum.
Yeah.
It's almost half, which is wild to me. But
wow.
It's fluidity in kind of everything in their life. It's like they're not landing hard on any one thing.
Well, and I think you see that in terms of, let's say, if they're keyed in on technology, social media is how they connect in many ways. It's not like they're looking at their email.
Yeah.
They're chatting or Snapchatting or whatever. That's how they communicate. How often do trends change?
Oh, yeah. And it's a constant flow of information. It's a constant change where it's like previous generations, you might get your newspaper and it would tell you what happened 2 weeks ago.
Right.
It's like you digested information so much more slowly and you could handle that a little bit better. Today, with the bombardment of information, it's like you can't keep up with everything that's happening. But yeah, F is for fluidity. O is for overwhelmed, which is why it made me think about this, because they are overwhelmed. And a lot of what they're overwhelmed with is just the amount of options they have, which may sound weird, but it's like they have so many more choices in their lives just from the beginning than even I did as a millennial, than any generation before. And it's like, how do you make up your mind? Because they also suffer from FOMO and FOMO.
I'm glad you mentioned this. I like this.
And this is something I see a lot, but FOMO, we make jokes that my baby, who is 8 months old, has FOMO because we can't get her to fall asleep if something's happening. If someone's there, she wants to be awake and she will fight it because she has FOMO. FOMO is another acronym for fear of missing out.
Right.
And I think social media has a lot to play with this because you're sitting here looking at everybody else's highlight reel on their social, and your behind the scenes of your everyday life doesn't equal their highlight reel. And you're sitting there scrolling through, looking at everybody going to concerts, going to parties and all this kind of stuff. And you have this fear of missing out on things in your life.
Well, I think about it in my generation when I was with peer group and heard about something in culture, whether it was a musician or in my later years, MTV and music videos. Oh, did you see that music video? No, I didn't. Mm-hmm. And right away, I don't belong.
Exactly.
Group. I don't know what's going on. And that doesn't feel very good, especially when you're a teenager and you want to be liked and to belong. Mm-hmm. When your culture changes multiple times a day, how do you keep up enough to be able to have the conversations with your peers when it comes to culture and things like that?
If you miss one thing, boom, you're out. So it's like you have to constantly be on guard and like on the lookout. You're like, filtering everything that comes at you. But that also kind of brings up humans just in general have this sort of us versus them mentality, this sort of
my group and white, and not my
versus
group.
Exactly. And that has, I think all of this, that FOMO, all of this has heightened that, which is why we see so much divide right now, I think, just across the board. Because while Gen Zers, this is most prevalent with them, the rest of the generations aren't immune to it. If you're on social media, they say if you spend 2 hours, I think was kind of the mark. Once you hit that 2 hour mark of social media in a day, it makes you so much more prone to anxiety, depression, and some mental disorders. It's like if you can limit your social media to less than 2 hours, you're automatically going to be less depressed, less anxious because just what it does to you. And that's not just Gen Z, that's all of us.
Well, that's convicting because I've seen similar stats and it has to do with your brain chemicals.
Yeah.
The dopamine you get from scrolling through this stuff.
It's like the same reaction that you get from like slot machines. Because, you pull it and it's just like, that next one might be the winner, that next one. And the psychology that keeps you sitting in a casino basically is the same thing that keeps you refreshing or scrolling through your TikTok.
I mean, if we were all honest, how many of us would say that we've looked up at the clock, our watch, whatever, and realized almost an hour's gone by?
Yeah.
And we've been Facebook, Instagram, YouTube videos, whatever it is.
So we're not going to get into this today. This will be a topic later on because I've been doing some reading and some research on this topic as well. But the shortening of our attention spans, it's a real thing. Yeah. It's a real thing. I was listening to a podcast where they were talking about how books used to be entertainment. Well, and then it got to the point where books kind of felt a little bit like work, but movies were an escape. Movies were pure entertainment. And then TV shows kind of became easier to digest. And movies almost felt like more of an investment, more like work.
Yep.
Because they were long. It's like, I know I got to devote at least 2 hours of my time to this movie.
Or three.
Or three, whatever. Well, and now it's like even TV shows for some people feel like an investment.
Yeah.
And feel like work. But you can get on your phone and you can scroll through TikTok and you'll end up spending 2-3 hours scrolling through TikTok when you could have watched the movie. But it's like you didn't have to commit all the way to the movie. So anyways, that's a little sidebar. That'll be a sneak peek for a later episode.
Yeah, fascinating.
So FOMO, the fear of missing out on something. And then the other one is FOMO. FOMO is fear of messing up because they're terrified of making a mistake.
Man, this is so relevant.
And there are a ton of different factors that all go into this as well, whether it's because so much of their lives are lived on the internet and cancel culture is such a thing. You say one wrong word or you post one wrong picture and the world crucifies you. It's a terrible thing, but that has sort of bled out into everybody's everyday life to where you're afraid to mess up anything, which has created a bad perfectionist culture, which I'm not immune to at all. I'm bad about that.
It leads to the anxiety we've talked about. And I think I've heard people say that for this Generation Z, they're fragile snowflakes. Like you can't say anything. They're going to lose their mind, or they're always going to need modifications, or they're going to need some accommodation to make up for their personalities, etc. Well, if you think about all of these things that we've talked about in terms of all the options, the fear of messing up, the anxiety level is actually higher. And one of the stats that I was hearing recently is that the amount of anxiety that people in this generation face today is similar to what back in the 60s,
50s maybe,
50s to 60s, a person in a psych ward would have experienced.
That's crazy.
And so it really is, and we've talked about mental illness in this podcast so many times. That's, I think, one of the reasons why we're experiencing it.
It's a real thing right now, for sure. Yeah.
And so the paradigm that Dr. Elmore talked about with entering their career for this Gen Z, I'm coping and hoping.
Yes.
So there's still a positivity. I have access to all this information. I have a lot of tools. but I'm really anxious about it all, and I'm just not sure. And that's where I think a lot of misperceptions come into play. There is that sense of anxiety, and so that's why it looks like they're fragile, because they are dealing with some stuff.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
And, they are the beneficiaries of things like September 11th, the .com bust. It seems like we have in the news, there's a shooting or a bombing, every week. They have their smartphone. They have access to a lot of good stuff, a lot of bad stuff too.
Yeah.
And so it's just very overwhelming. And what does that do to an adult, much less someone who's still developing their personality and character?
And along with all the FOMO and FOMO and everything, we haven't even addressed the fact that a lot of their formative years were spent locked up in a pandemic.
Oh, absolutely.
For a lot of the older generations, it's kind of a blip on the radar. They've got so much life other than that. But even if you're 22, you've spent a 10th of your life locked up. And so it's a different perspective, especially when you're, locked up during high school or college. That really affects some of that formative behavior. R is for reinvention.
Okay.
And this actually explained quite a bit to me, because I see this even in church when I'm trying to introduce something new. I've always approached it, you got to boil the frog. You change one thing, let people get used to that. You change one little thing, and it's like, death by 1,000 cuts. It's this incremental change. Well, Gen Zers hate that. Gen Zers hate incremental change, because, again, the R stands for reinvention. They want to reinvent. If they see something that's not working, they don't want incremental change. They want a facelift. They want to tear it down and start over, which is why you see things like defund the police and things like that, which
doesn't make sense to me.
It doesn't make a ton of sense to even me. But when you look at it through that lens, where it's like they're looking at us and saying, guys, what are y'all doing? This is not working. We need to start over. We need to figure this out differently.
Right.
Because it's less about making those incremental changes to get better over time. They don't want to wait. They want it better now.
Well, and in the light of our current environment, they might not have tomorrow.
Exactly.
With the world the way it is and all of these things going on, that's the way it could feel.
Yeah. Well, that's the way it's feeling to me. I'll mention that book one more time that I've been reading by your buddy Pete. Peter Zion. The book's called The End of the World is Just the Beginning, and he's talking about how the world is collapsing, and within the next 10 years, the world is not going to look the same. And so it's kind of scared me a little bit, but I mean, the future isn't promised to any of us, and I mean, that's biblical. True.
Jesus
come back tomorrow.
Right.
But they live with it a little bit more imminently than the rest of us do.
Yep.
So that's the R. R is reinvention. The E is actually for entrepreneurship. They are much more entrepreneurial. They don't want to join something that already exists. They want to create something, which I think is good and valuable for our society, and we could really benefit from that and use that. But it's a different mindset than what earlier generations had grew up with, which is be grateful you have a job.
Right.
Don't worry about trying to start your own job, because so many of them are leveraging social media to make money. They kind of control it themselves because they're just making money off of their phone. They don't have to go to a 9-to-5 job.
Right.
Why would I do that when I can make TikTok videos or YouTube videos or whatever? And
very flexible that way.
Yeah. I'm going to be entirely honest. I have aspirations of being a YouTube star.
Yes, you do.
And I can't blame them for having that, because we see that as an actual viable career option these days. And I see that the ability to control your schedule, the ability to do what you want, not have somebody else tell you when to do it, how to do it, what to do. And because I saw a Simon Sinek thing where he was talking about one of his earlier jobs where he was working for someone and he did what they asked him to, and he got a better result than what they were, but he didn't do it exactly the way they asked him to. And he got in trouble for it because he didn't do it how they asked him to do it.
Right.
And he was like, I did what you asked. I got better results, but I didn't go about it the way you wanted me to. But they were like, but yeah, that's policy. And it's like, well, who made the arbitrary policy? Like, this is a better way to do it.
It's like Tony the paint, paint guy.
Exactly. And it's so they are much more entrepreneurial. And part of that has to do with because they have so many options available to them.
Yep.
You talked about life as a cafeteria for the millennials and how we just, pick and choose what we want as we go down the buffet line. The problem with them is there are too many options on this
Yeah.
buffet.
Yeah.
It's like somebody backed a dump truck up and just dumped everything onto this buffet, and there's just too many choices to dig through.
Yep.
And so it's an overwhelming choice.
Yep. And we've talked about some negatives, but there's some positives too. I think Gen Zs are better savers.
Yes. I don't know if it's that entrepreneurial spirit in them, but
Or, they're saving up for what might happen.
the end of the world.
They might need it.
Which brings us to the letter I. So if we're doing our foreign acronym, we're fluid, overwhelmed, reinvention, entrepreneurial, and then I is independent.
That makes sense.
Yeah. And we've touched on some of these reasons, I think, because, well, they were raised by Gen Xers, I think has a lot to do with it.
Right.
But also these sort of niche categories when everything's more fractured and everybody kind of lives in their own sort of little bubble. We talked about how even people within a family can have different interests and different things, which has sort of isolated them more to a degree. You have the pandemic. One of the differences they talk about between millennials and Gen Zers is millennials. Yeah, we got participation trophies, but we learned as a team.
Right.
We learned how to work as a group, where Gen Zers haven't really had that experience. They've been much more independent, whether they chose it or not. Again, I think that can be good or that can be bad because they're not bound by... I feel like I have a little bit of this independence in me as well, because a lot of times if somebody tells me to do something, I'm going to do the opposite just to show them that they can't tell me what to do.
Right.
It's not always a good thing for me.
Well, and I think when we didn't talk about it, but when we come to their view of authority, they're really pretty distrustful of them because many times they do see that they know more than the people in authority. They're not sure that they need them.
Yeah.
One example I've heard is in terms of in a college situation, I think this came up in the podcast where they see a lot of the Gen Z folks that are coming in very particular about, yes, this is my professor, but that person's not my mentor.
Oh, yeah.
They're choosing who they want to influence them.
Yeah.
They'll even come up and say, can you be my mentor? Whereas in the past, it was just sort of the people in authority that became mentors for us. They're now actively choosing who they want to be influenced by.
Yeah. Which I don't necessarily think is a bad thing.
I agree.
I mean, there are some dangers of that because you might miss out on somebody that could be a really good mentor that you're not aware of, so you don't know to choose them.
Right.
So I think it's a two-edged sword there.
Yep. So what about G and N?
So G is geek.
Now
Yes.
I can relate.
And again, we've touched on some of this, but Gen Zers are much more tech savvy. Again, they've grown up with smartphones in their hands since they were toddlers. So they're just more adept at navigating that. They're used to seeing some of these changes, so they can kind of roll with new stuff a lot quicker than even I can, really. I try to keep up. But they are much more tech savvy. For a lot of the reasons, the TikToks, the YouTubes, we've talked about a lot of that. They also, I don't know, he didn't talk about this. This is just one of my own observations. When I think of geek, I think of somebody that is sort of like hyper obsessed with a certain thing. And I see that because they each can find their own little niche, they tend to like draw in on one particular like interest and go 110%, go super deep into that thing and really geek out on something.
That's right.
And I love that. But it makes them a little more hyper-focused on certain things than others.
One quote that I saw was that a Gen Zer came up in an employee situation and said, I can't figure out how you can be so wise and so clueless at the same time.
Yeah.
That's an opportunity, I think, for those of us who may not be in that exact same category to be able to mentor in some of the intangibles, whether it kind of be character things or leadership qualities, things that they might not necessarily be in 150% deep and can help broaden some of their character a little bit.
Yeah.
So you talked about G. What about N?
N is for networked because they are so much more, again, we've touched on this too, they are networked to the rest of the world more than any other generation before them because they may be playing a video game, but they might be playing with somebody from the Philippines and somebody from the UK. And so they're talking to these people from all over the world and they're more globally conscious, I think, than a lot of previous generations because, heck, even, with my parents, the world was kind of limited to your community and, maybe a little bit beyond, but as social media and things like that have sprung up, the world in some regards has shrunk quite a bit because we can get news instantly from around the world. I don't know, Gen Zers, because they're plugged in so much more, they're just connected all the time. That's why the N stands for networked.
So this is all good information, and I think I connect with it really well and helps explain a lot of things. But I want to try and see if we can land this plane.
Yeah, we need to. We're
and figure out
we're pushing the time a little bit.
how this relates to church. I think I saw some research recently from the Barna Group that 77% of people polled believe in God or a higher power. Mm-hmm. That's pretty high there.
Yeah.
74% even would like to grow spiritually. And 44% are more open to God today than before the pandemic.
Yeah.
All of that is fertile ground for some good Jesus follower stuff.
Mm-hmm. Well,
but I do think that the church has to adjust. I mean, how do we include these generations when in some congregations the leadership is a boomer, for example, or how do we bridge the gap between these generations?
Well, honestly, I think the first step is talking, just like anything, you've got to be aware of the situation to do anything to address it. The first step is admitting you have a problem. But I mean, I think that is key, and just not immediately, oh, they're lazy, they're a slacker, they're whatever, and trying to understand their perspective and where they're coming from, being empathetic and compassionate to people that are different than you. It's almost like, hey, maybe we should do what the Bible says. But it's rather than condemning or condescending to anybody that's different than you. It's like, you talked about the hashtags. This goes both ways. This isn't just the older generations getting onto the younger generations. This is younger generations that could be learning from mentors, because there is some wisdom there. Yeah, they may not be able to hook up a DVD player on their own, but they've got some good wisdom for you.
Mm-hmm. And the other direction, like I just said, there may be someone as a Gen Zer who knows tons and tons about the latest iPhone, etc. Not to stereotype that necessarily, but they don't really understand what it means to work for something when you don't get it immediately.
Yes.
And so those relationships, mentoring between the generations, is super critical. I think one of the things we do pretty well around Northside, not to necessarily toot our own horn, but offer different ways to communicate.
Yes.
The newer generations some of them don't even use email.
Yeah.
Right? Because email's full of junk. Mm-hmm. So they've abandoned that for sure. So doing those kinds of things, the mentorship, I think, is important. In a work world, the word office means something different now.
Oh, yeah.
So a physical space, we've talked to Ben Harris, where we talked about the where you can set up a remote office in that space if you need to do your business and whatever. You don't have to have an actual office. And for a lot of Gen Z people, especially after the pandemic, and that goes for millennials, et cetera, the option to work at home is something we're going to deal with, for a long time.
Well, this was an interesting thing I heard as well, was that a lot of Gen Zers and the students, that younger generation, are more willing to get into church than their parents are. And it's like they're willing to come to church more than their parents are. Yeah. Which is interesting to me, because it's not what I thought. And so it kind of goes against my previous assumptions, but it's interesting.
I think, as we've said before, the human spirit is still important.
Yes.
As much technology as we have and will continue to have, I don't think you will ever be able to get away from that.
Yeah.
And that's why the story of Jesus is relevant 2,000 years ago and will still be relevant. As long as there are humans made in God's image, we will still have an opportunity to connect that way. How we do it is going to be different. This is a challenge for me. If we can't see the world through a different lens, we're not going to connect.
If we can't even see value in a different perspective, I think that's a major flaw.
So many times we get hung up in our way of doing things that is valuable and meaningful to us. No knock on that. We grew up in a different way than various different people on either generation, on either side of us. If we hold on to that it's so sacrosanct, that we can't get past it, I think that's where we're missing an opportunity to connect with people who are just as broken and hurting as we are, and according to the research, want to proceed in growing in faith.
Just a little bit of food for thought.
Food for thought, yes.
Man, I wish we could have figured out something to talk about this episode.
Well, hey, if you've listened to this...
It's a good thing Glenn wasn't here. We would have...
Thank you, Glenn.
Yeah.
If you listen to this and you're interested in more, we'll put some links in our show notes to some of this stuff. And if you'd like to hear us talk more about this, specifically as it relates to church, we'd be glad to talk about this, because at least for me, speaking for me, it really was relevant in a lot of different ways and kind of opened my eyes to, oh, that's why this particular person is the way they are.
Yeah. I've always liked to step back and look at the big picture. I feel like that's kind of what has helped me do the job that I do, because I can kind of step back and see how we're putting a service together as a whole. I just like looking at that big picture.
Right.
Well, this has kind of helped me zoom out even further and looking at the different generations, how they react. And I made this this kind of joke, this analogy. It's like I'm seeing the Matrix now, at the end of the movie when he starts seeing the world in the green text.
How it really is.
I'm seeing the green in the Matrix now. So well, now that we've solved all the world's problems in that regard, let's talk about a few of the things going on here at Northside.
Yep.
Some Northside news. So get your calendars out, get your pencils ready, get your iPhones out, whatever, and mark some of these dates down. This should get us through the end of April here. So starting tomorrow, there's a slight time adjustment for Wednesday night activities. Everything's the same except for the activities are going to start at 6:30 instead of 6:15, just to kind of give us a little bit more breathing room around the service there.
This is March 22nd.
Yep, March 22nd. And then April 2nd, which is coming up quick, is Palm Sunday. So you don't want to miss those Sunday morning services. And then that afternoon from 3 o'clock to 5 o'clock p.m. is the Easter egg hunt. We say it's an Easter egg hunt, but there's a lot more to it. There's a petting zoo, there's animal rides, there's inflatable jumpers.
It's an egg extravaganza.
Hey! And then April 7th is Good Friday. We'll have our Good Friday service at 7 o'clock p.m. in the sanctuary. I believe we're also going to live stream that one, so if you can't make it out on a Friday night for that, be sure to tune in. And then April 9th is Super Bowl for the churches. It's Easter Sunday. We're going to kick things off with an Easter sunrise service at 6 a.m., and then we'll have all of our regular services, so 8 a.m., 9:15, and 10:30. Men of Northside on April 14th, again, that's a Friday night. Save this date, April 14th, 6:30 p.m. We're going to have sort of a men's get-together. So all the men of Northside, we're going to get together at Bill Spann's house. We're probably going to grill out or something, have some good food and some good conversation, and kind of talk about men's ministry here at Northside. So be sure to put that on your calendar. April 21st through the 23rd is going to be the renewed youth event here, which is going to be a big deal. And we'll have Glenn talk a little bit more about that on our next episode. So if you want more information on that, check out next week's episode. And then also on April 23rd, that Sunday, the morning schedule is going to be a little different. We're going to have 9 o'clock Sunday school, 10 o'clock a joint service in the sanctuary led by our children and youth, and then a church congregation meeting in Hope Hall at 11:30. And there'll be lunch provided and a nursery provided for that. But you don't want to miss that. We're going to have some good conversation there too. Also, don't forget to email the Board of Elders or the Board of Servant Directors any of your thoughts about new service schedules, just really anything that comes to mind about the church that you want to share your opinion. You can email those elders@northsidejackson.com and servantdirectors@northsidejackson.com. Next week, we're going to have Jill Donnell on the podcast. She's going to be talking about what it's like to be a woman in ministry. So we're really looking forward to getting her in here to talk about that. If you've got questions you'd like for us to ask her, you can send those in to podcast@northsidejackson.com. Did I miss anything? No? Oh, okay. Well, hey, thanks for podcasting with me. And thanks to all of you out there in the world for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, please share it with others, post about it on social media, or leave a rating and review. To catch all the latest from us, you can follow us on Instagram at Northside Now Podcast. Go to our website, northsidejackson.com, or email us at podcast@northsidejackson.com. We hope to hear from you soon. Once again, this is Patrick.
I'm Kevin.
And that's what's happening at Northside Now.
Bye-bye.